Thank you for joining us. Today is we're focusing on connecting Michigan communities and specifically some of the things that some of our more local communities are doing. This is the second in a series of webinars that we are hosting related to broadband and technology development in the state of Michigan. Today, we're joined by Eric Frederick, Executive Director of Connected Nation Michigan, and the VP of Community Affairs for Connected Nation, as well as Dan Manning, whom both serve as Community Technology Advisors for Connected Nation Michigan. Said both looking for Tom Stevenson to potentially join us. He had a conflict that came up and was unable to join. So there's a chance he may join us. Otherwise, we'll lean against Dan and Eric for all of their infinite wisdom this morning. Thank you for joining me, guys.
Glad to be here. Thanks, Wes.
We were talking just a moment ago, and it's always good to have a little bit of an icebreaker and get comfortable while people are watching us on screen and listening to us. And so, we were talking, and so I thought it'd be neat to hear what you all may be doing to prepare for the holiday season. So, are there any holiday traditions that you all kind of engage in or would be interested in sharing?
Well, Wes, we have two in our house. I guess two big ones. First was we always get a real Christmas tree. So we went out this past weekend and got that most important of Christmas symbols, the Christmas tree. It's a nice 8-foot tree, and we always decorate it with ornaments that were given to us every year that meant something, something important or a milestone from that year. So it's a very diverse looking tree, not a lot of bulbs or anything on it, but mostly very unusual ornaments that have been collected over the years. And the second tradition that we have is on Christmas Eve, we always have a dinner of Chinese food. It's one of those things that we picked up as kids, and that I've continued to my family. So whether it's either homemade or takeout or a combination of both, we always do Chinese food on Christmas Eve.
Dan, how about you?
Well, I guess ours is somewhat along the same lines, with the exception of the Chinese, which I find a little odd. But we essentially go out and cut down our own tree as well, and got it this year earlier than I think we ever have, as I think a lot of people are probably in the same boat this year. Everybody anxious for the holidays to come in light of the pandemic and all. But we got that done. Typically around the Christmas holiday, we do a lot of visiting with family and friends, and certainly a lot of that will be limited this year, but we'll make the most of what we've got.
That's great. We're starting around our house. It seems like we're doing just more games and typically, we're going to make more Christmas candy than we need to, I'm sure. But it's, like you said, we started a little earlier, and the Christmas tree has been up for a while, and we don't do the traditional live Christmas tree, but it's up and gorgeous, and my wife's done a wonderful job. So we'll get right on into today's conversation and discussion. And so the first thing is, Eric, Connected Nation Michigan, Connect Michigan, as many will recognize, has been working in the state for several years. Do you mind to give a quick overview of the work that CN Michigan does?
Sure. So you're right. We've been around in Michigan since, very, very late 2009 is when we were first started as part of the state broadband initiative. That was a Department of Commerce project back in the day. So we've been around for more than a decade now, working to address the access, adoption, and use of broadband. So we're kind of an unusual entity in the state. A state agency. We're not a private company. We're a nonprofit. So our goal as a nonprofit and our mission is to improve quality of life through the expansion of broadband. And so, because that's a pretty big umbrella, especially now, with the COVID pandemic, it means addressing things like infrastructure access, affordability, digital literacy, job training related to broadband, and then of course how those technologies are used to improve quality of life. So, looking at things like telehealth or one-to-one device programs in schools. And then a myriad of other things that are impacted by broadband, which these days is the things that aren't impacted by broadband is a much shorter list. So we work with various state agencies in Michigan to do a number of those things, help advise policy. We help implement the Michigan Broadband Roadmap that was published in 2018, making sure that's still up to speed and is recommending the things that need to be updated. We do broadband mapping. We help administer the Connecting Michigan Communities Grant Program through DTMB. We've worked on a couple telehealth initiatives with the Michigan Health Endowment Fund in the past. So we try to be the clearinghouse and point of contact for broadband in the state and help unsilo broadband at level and make sure that Michigan is getting better connected and making sure that we are improving that quality of life through the expansion of broadband access, adoption, and use.
Thanks, Eric. And Dan, if you wouldn't mind, would you take a moment to kind of explain what the role of community technology advisor is and the work that you and Tom do in the state?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And it's something that I really enjoy as well. And I tend to think of us as being advocates for Michigan communities and the leaders in those communities on anything related to broadband and helping them advance some solutions and figure out ways of getting better broadband service. Access, adoption, and use is something we always talk about, being able to expand that access so more and more people within their communities have got the connectivity that they need, get more people equipped so that they can take advantage of those kind of connections and use the internet to their best capability. And know how to use the applications and all that. So it's really more of an advocate role for communities. Oftentimes we think of ourselves as facilitators as well. Spend a lot of time kind of bringing groups together, partly through our Connected Community Engagement Program, which is a formalized approach to doing broadband with our communities. But also just bringing together the right groups to talk about partnerships and ways people can work together to help bring some of these solutions to the table and all. And then also there's a role related to education and getting some of our community leaders a little bit more comfortable with broadband technology, the terminology, understanding what the issues are related to that and how it impacts them and trying to get better service across their group. So kind of an advocate, a facilitator, an educator, and overall kind of a catalyst to kind of bring the right parties together in order to understand what the issues are to begin with, and then work toward a solution that makes sense for that community.
And let's talk about some of the things that communities in the state have been doing or are doing over the past, even the past few years. Would one of you want to talk about that a little bit, and kind of the interactions that you've had, but maybe some of the I don't know, projects that you might highlight?
I can give you maybe some general points as it relates to that are kind of common for most of the work that both Tom and I do as we work with communities. One of which that seems to work pretty well, and something that we typically start with, is the whole idea of just forming a broadband team, or at least a focal point within a community, to be able to respond to broadband related issues and give residents and businesses a common place to go to in order to bring those kind of concerns and hopefully get some help in addressing those. And I think being able to bring in all the right kind of stakeholders that have a vested interest in broadband to the table to be part of this committee or to act in that focal point role is important, so that we've got representation from the various groups that are really interested in that, and it's so important to them. So, the K-12 schools, the local governments, the libraries, economic development organizations, chambers of commerce to represent the business community, all those kind of groups, and having kind of a broad representation of those kind of sectors within this broadband team is something that's become really important. And then to be able to leverage, one of the things that we find that works really well is when you can get those kind of leaders from those different groups together in one room. There's often some kind of magic that often happens where they realize they've got some common goals. Maybe they've never worked together before, but broadband's kind of bring them together to the same place because they have the same issues, and they can find ways to work together to help advance that a lot easier as a group than they could on their own. So it's those kind of things that help with a lot of that. We've had examples in some communities where you bring some some particular group to the table that maybe has already doing some things related to broadband that can help other sectors and have them share that expertise. I think those kind of things are really helpful.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think adding into that mix of local leaders and local stakeholders from all of those critical sectors is important, but then also making sure that those local stakeholders know who in their community provides broadband service. In Michigan, we do mapping for the state of Michigan, and we map approximately 150 internet service providers across the state. And I would say half of those providers are small fixed wireless companies, or they're smaller, more independent telephone companies or others that local stakeholders might not be aware of, or might not know provide service to their community. So making sure that we're bringing the private sector to those discussions as well, and try to bridge the gap between public and private, help each side understand each other, the limitations of certain technologies, and make aware the areas of the community that service or are wanting better service. And I think, Dan, you said it best, when you get these folks in a room, there is some magic that happens. There's an understanding that, oh, we didn't know you were doing this, so how can we build on that? And making sure that those conversations are happening at that local scale, I think is really critical for communities to better engage in the broadband development process.
And I can take that just one step further to give you a little more specific example. This goes back a little bit, but our St. Clair County team that we've been working with for a number of years, when they first started along this path, they formed one of those broadband teams of the leaders from the additional sectors, and brought them together, and discovered at that time that St. Clair RESA, their educational group there, had been doing a lot as it relates to expanding education across their schools, or broadband across their schools, but also was working very closely with a number of different broadband providers in the area. And that turned into something that we capitalize on and leverage in order to work with those same providers and expand the use into other parts of the county, to residents and local businesses as well. So you kind of identify where some of that expertise is, some of that experience is, that you can leverage to do some other things. And because St. Clair County was so involved with this and had such a great team going at the time, if you remember back a few years ago, back in the early 2017, when Governor Snyder was in office, he had announced this big initiative toward building infrastructure across the state. And he had this infrastructure week where he was going around to key cities around the state to announce different parts of infrastructure that he was announcing some new programs for. So because of a lot of the work that the St. Clair County team had done, they were picked to be the focal point for announcing the broadband initiatives related to Infrastructure Week, and had a big event out there and lots of press that came out of that. So that was just an example of the kind of things that spin off of some of these gatherings of teams in order to focus on broadband.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the things that we hear in the field from communities, from ISPs, and from others, what are some of the pain points both sides are feeling? What are the issues? What are some success stories? What are some lessons learned? And I think by being able to take that information up to the state level and make sure state agencies hear that information, make sure policymakers hear that information, and who are in a position to make things better for the entire broadband ecosystem is also important. So, we've been engaging with communities across the state to do just that, to make sure that we're gathering grassroots information on what some of the issues are, and what some of the success stories are, so we can scale that up to the state and make change happen in a positive way that benefits all Michiganders.
Yeah, and while you all have been talking, we've had a couple of questions come in, a couple of comments, and so I encourage everyone to continue to do that. And what we'll do, I think, is try to answer those questions towards the end of our time here this morning. We may answer some of these as we go through and kind of discuss this a little further. And certainly there will be, there's certainly an opportunity to reach out to us, and we'll be more than happy to help help you get the answers that you need, or get you in touch with the right people to further discuss some of the things that you're asking about. Um, in your all's opinion, what are the most important things for communities to be focused on right now? If they want to help grow and expand broadband and technology access, adoption, and use, what should they be focused on? There's an obvious focus on access and availability of broadband services. But what we also know is that there are all these other facets in the adoption and use side that oftentimes get overlooked, which really impact the equation for seeing expanded or greater broadband availability.
Well, I think there's a number of them. One of which we already talked about was this whole idea of getting a focal point or a team of some kind in place to focus on broadband related issues for your particular community. I think another part of that is to really understand who your providers are, and start developing some relationships with those folks. They're in a pretty competitive and tough business, and I think the more that we can work toward some partnerships and fostering those relationships, understanding the issues that are affecting them, is certainly helpful. That'll make it easier going forward to figure out expansion plans. But you talk about adoption related issues as well, Wes, and those are key as well. If sometimes, even if you have all the infrastructure in place, people aren't going to take advantage of it for one reason or another. So there are skills related issues, and the ability for us or somebody else to provide some training and orientation to folks to get them to better know how to leverage the internet, how to use it, take advantage of the technology that way. Cost is another issue. And that's one of the things that we focus on with a lot of the surveys that we do, is understanding, if how much cost is a barrier certainly for some families more than others, and what kind of programs are available to help alleviate some of that. So those are the kind of things that we ought to be focusing on as well, and understand that, and then work out, like I mentioned earlier as well, to seek out some kind of partnerships with various parties in order to help with expansion of infrastructure, as well as how we're going to handle some of these adoption issues. I think a lot of the kind of the easy work as it relates to broadband expansion is kind of been done already by the main providers. But now when we try to isolate and get to those areas that are pockets of geographies that aren't getting good service, it's going to take some combination of companies and organizations working together to figure out how we're going to best deliver service to those areas.
Yeah, I think that's right. In building those public-private, private-private, public-public partnerships, whatever it takes to get service out there is going to be key, but it's got to be a partnership. I mean, as you get more rural, the cost to provide service goes up exponentially as household density drops. And trying to reach all those areas is going to be a challenge. So again, getting like Dan said, getting to know your internet service providers, and I think the communities can help by getting more specific with where the problems lie. So instead of saying, the rural parts of X county doesn't have service, how can we be more specific and say, the northwest corner of this township doesn't have service? Getting more granular with how we identify where the service gaps are can really help, form a better solution, because then we're able to target those areas a lot easier. So I think that's one thing a community team can help do, is start by better identifying where those areas are, and then working with the ISP community to start forming those partnerships. And again, it's public-private, it's private-private, it's public-public, whatever type of partnership there is that can get the job done, I think is what needs to happen in these places. We're talking about fairly rural areas, and again, as we get more rural, and certainly Michigan has lots of rural areas, the cost to provide that service does go up. We're gonna go on a little bit of a tangent, where that model of higher cost doesn't go up as you get more rural, and that's with recent developments, as I'm sure some folks on this webinar have heard about, SpaceX and Starlink, the low Earth orbit satellite systems. And the satellite is available in Michigan. They're beta testing that product in Michigan, in the northern parts of the state. And that's great because you don't have to have the wired costs or the tower costs to locate equipment in those rural areas. However, the cost of that service is fairly expensive at the moment. So when, even though that service is fast, I mean, it's some of the speed tests I've been seeing are over 100 megabits per second. It's a $500 installation cost, $100 a month, and that can be out of reach for a lot of households, no matter where you live. So, have they solved the infrastructure question? No, not completely. And even if they did, is the affordability piece an issue? So there's always this back and forth of, making sure it's available and making sure it's affordable. And so, the costs are still what they are, even if you don't have to run infrastructure down every road to every single house.
Eric, I'm going to add to that. We talked about the low Earth orbit satellite systems in the first of this series, and you're right, from an infrastructure standpoint, it's I'm at least optimistic about the opportunity that those systems bring. But one of the things that I think you really hone in on there is that cost issue, and cost is so subjective in our communities. I had a conversation yesterday about this, that it's subjective to each individual household. And so, communities in areas where communities want to begin to work, thinking about how they can help, if you're an extremely rural community, are there ways that you can help mitigate the cost issue for, residents in your community? Those are the kinds of areas that I think communities maybe sometimes overlook, because we get so fixed on trying to address the access piece. With that said, are there any, Dan, are there hurdles that you typically see? You've worked with I wouldn't even begin to guess how many communities you've worked with in Michigan and other states around the country now, but are there like, they're just those hurdles that you're going to run into when you start working within a community, as far as as they're trying to organize? What are those, and do you have any advice of how they can help mitigate those on their own?
Yeah, it's a great question, and there certainly are some challenges, especially in just getting started with the whole broadband planning process. One of them is, and I alluded to it a little bit earlier, is this whole idea of getting a common understanding of broadband concepts. Again, the terminology, who the players are, how it works, just from a high level. We certainly don't want to get everybody to become broadband experts, but at least to have a common understanding, so that when we do have conversations with providers, you can have that kind of coherent conversation and get something out of it at the same time. So a lot of what we do, both Tom and I and Eric as well, when we work with communities and leaders, is to help bring some of that basic understanding there, and a certain level of education, just to kind of fill in the blanks for those people that are struggling a little bit, just to understand why things work the way that they work. Another one is I kind of call it recognizing the market, the broadband market, if you will, and the influences that go into that. And what I mean by that is understand, what the incentives are for broadband providers and what it's going to take for them to come into your community and build out, and the business case that they have to look at in order for that to operate, what the different technologies are, because each provider may have a different technology they're bringing to the table. We frankly don't care one way or another what kind of technology it is. We're kind of agnostic that way. And the same with providers. We don't have any preferred providers. We're just looking for the best solution for a community. But the local team there needs to understand what all of these different variations are in the market, and what kind of funding programs might be available to help offset some of that too, and the costs involved in doing broadband expansion. So just having an understanding of how that whole market works and what the incentives are and so on is really helpful. And then finally, there's oftentimes a feeling that broadband is happening all around us in my community, and there's not a whole lot I can do about it other than scream and yell and tell people that I need better service. And I think, what we try to bring is a more structured approach to understanding what those issues are. And like Eric was saying, if we can get down to a level of detail to understand a little bit more precisely where the access problem is, what part of your particular county or township, what do they need, and understand all of that a little bit better. Then it's easier to get your arms around it and actually take action as a local community and do something about it, rather than just kind of venting out to the world that you need some help. So we try to make that a little bit more practical, and I think it just takes some time to kind of work through that. But a lot of that comes back to the leadership on the local team there. If you've got people that are used to getting things done, haven't been in leadership positions, and can make some decisions and help move forward, I think that's real helpful as well.
Thanks, Dan. And Tom, it looks like you joined us right here as we're here in just a moment. We'll jump into some questions or try to take some more questions from everyone. Sure. And we're glad you made it. We've hit a lot of different things, but as we kind of begin to wrap up and talk about questions here, Eric, I'm gonna kind of pivot to you for a second. Next month in January, we'll start these webinars on a bi-weekly schedule, and the first one will be on the 19th. And Eric, you and I are going to spend some time that day talking about specifically, or more specifically, about what the state is doing or what's happening at the state level, and maybe even compare a little bit about what, how that compares across the country, related to broadband and technology issues and the things that the state is trying to do to advance those things. And so with that, do you have any advice now for communities as they look to engage at the state level or look to engage at a greater level beyond just locally? Who would they talk to? Who do we, how do they handle those types of inbound requests and things?
Sure. So we've been doing a lot at the state level, like you said, and I think two of the biggest things that have happened this year with broadband, Governor Whitmer announced before Thanksgiving, is the Connecting Michigan Communities Grant Program. So the state has appropriated an additional $14 million to that grant program, the Connecting Michigan Communities Grant Program, like I said, CMIC. And so that program's application window is open right now, michigan.gov/CMIC. That's one thing the state's doing. But the other, I think, which is a kind of a broader, more long-term approach, is the Connecting Michigan Task Force. And that was put together to try and, like I said before, kind of de-silo broadband at a state level. So this task force is made up of 13 state agencies where broadband is critical to what they do, or they incorporate broadband or directly work to improve broadband. So it's organizations like the MEDC, the Michigan Department of Agriculture, Technology Management and Budget, Public Service Commission, and so many more that we're all coming together to really address broadband and really work to implement recommendations from the 2018 Michigan Broadband Roadmap that was published. So that document was published at the end of administration. We had administration change, so there's a little bit of a lag in getting that off the ground. But really what this task force is doing is able to take questions and comments from communities, from providers, from stakeholders at every scale, and really find you to get that answer for them, whatever that question might be. And again, listen to the pain points and listen to the success stories so that better state policy can be made to improve broadband. So that task force is up and running. And again, I think is going to be a really great way to improve broadband for the state of Michigan overall. So we do have a website. One of the things we've done recently is improve the Connect Michigan website, so connectmi.org. We've reorganized and added a lot of resources on that website for residents, for businesses, for communities, for ISPs. There's some policy and planning documents on there. Most recently, we added a page on that site that summarizes and identifies federal and state funding opportunities for broadband that can be really critical for all of those entities to improve broadband, whether it's infrastructure or otherwise. So I would highly recommend checking that out as well, and that can be a conduit for those questions and comments and concerns that might be coming from stakeholders on this call or others that are out in the field.
Yeah, so let's move into a few questions, and please feel free to submit those in the question box. But I know there were a couple of at least a few comments and a couple of questions here, and comments about working with WISPs and local providers. And I think we've talked about that a little bit, but certainly we encourage. Hopefully, you've picked up on the fact that we encourage our local communities to reach out and learn and to discuss with their providers, find out who the providers are, fully understand who might be able to offer services in your community. And sometimes that's Dan and Tom can really attest to this. Sometimes that's maybe not a provider that's currently in that community, but somebody who is near, and being able to identify who those providers are that are near to you, particularly if you're in a real small or very rural community, being able to identify them, and work with them to at least have the conversations about whether or not you could develop a broadband services in your community. And again, as a community, maybe that's as Eric said, kind of talking through the partnership, the various different flavors of partnerships, public. I like that one, public, private, whatever they may be. What are those opportunities? I know there's a couple questions about specific technologies. I know that the WISPs throughout the state are looking at all various types of technologies that are out there. I know there's some specifics about frequencies that are potentially being utilized. Dan and Tom, you all work with some of the providers or have conversations. You all may be more familiar with some of the things that are being discussed, but there are enough fixed wireless providers in the state that I would not be surprised at all. I'm certain there are some who are developing private LTE and utilizing CBRS spectrum. Tom, I want to say that you've worked with a couple of providers that offer those services.
Yes, I have. Yes, and it's being developed right now. I think Ericsson, they're using Ericsson's equipment, and so it's in a debugging process right now. But we've got several communities. I've got a couple of communities that have actually developed public-private partnerships that are allowing. I got one in particular that have taken the county towers, and they're offering a low-rate subscription of $0 for the first 6 months they build out. And so this has become very attractive as far as a public-private partnership, and they'll be using that spectrum and a couple of the other licensed spectrums that we're seeing put out there. So yes, it's quite a common. It's getting more and more common every day. Originally, we started out with I think one of our first community was Clare County, and they're up to 16 towers now that they're allowing on a public-private partnership with the townships and the county and local providers, and offering a very low rate for the lease itself, so that what they're looking for is getting broadband out to their citizens. And so it's good, what do you call that, soft rate returns. So yeah, they don't make much money on the towers, but their citizens, it does help the local economy quite a bit. So.
All right. I don't see any other questions. I know there was a comment specific to a location in Manistee. Dan or Tom, would one of you all care to follow up?
Yeah, Manistee, yes. What was the question?
Would you care to follow up there on? I don't know that we can necessarily address that on today's webinar, but we can follow up and try to get an answer there. Correct?
Sure. Yeah, we can do that.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah. Hey, Wes, I see a couple others in here. So there's one that other funding opportunities to help rural communities. That's a good question. The Connecting Michigan Communities Grant Program, like I said, is probably, I think is probably one of the best aimed at extremely rural areas that don't have service at 25 by 3 megabits per second. And again, that application window is open now. And that's michigan.gov/CMIC. And I'm going to look that up just to make sure this is the right address. But I think at a broader level, there's two things we're looking at for new funding for rural communities. One was just announced yesterday, and that was DC's Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. That there was an auction that ended just before Thanksgiving, and Michigan. There are about 250,000 locations in Michigan, so households or businesses that had winning bids for that auction. The majority of those locations that were part of that auction, which includes very rural parts of the state are set to receive 1 gigabit per second connections because of that auction. Now, it is a 10-year build out time frame. So the companies that were winning bidders in that auction have 10 years to build out that infrastructure, but it is extremely good news for Michigan. I would like to hope that a lot of those ISPs that were winning bidders can build out faster than a 10-year time frame, although there's a lot of area to cover. But that's one funding area that was just announced, so it's not new funding, but it was just announced yesterday. So we were excited to see that. The second potential area for funding for rural communities is in whatever future relief package that is passed by Congress. There's been a lot of talk in Washington, D.C. about what those relief packages look like and include. And I know broadband's really been at the top of the list of those discussions for things to include in a relief package. So we've been watching that closely. Obviously, there's a lot of back and forth of what goes in there. But we will be the first to announce if something gets passed and it includes broadband. And somebody actually corrected me. So it's a 6-year build out for those RDOF funds with a 10-year payout by the FCC. So thanks, Bill, for clarifying that. I'm glad you did. So that's even better news. So I would watch what happens in Congress for additional funding for rural communities. And again, the CMIC Michigan grant program is probably going to be the best bet in the short term for rural places in the state.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we should probably clarify related to CMIC too, that those grants can only be applied for by broadband providers. So it's important that the communities team up with a local provider in order to come up with a common project that you can work together for. But the provider themselves has to be the one to apply for the funds.
That's true.
Yeah, and I saw a couple other questions. One related to the low Earth orbit satellite services and reliability, and quite honestly, it's really too early to know how reliable these services are going to be. At least initial reporting is that they seem to be. Most folks who are on the pilot are relatively satisfied with the reliability of the service. I've seen you can hit YouTube and find several reviews from folks. There's certainly some quirks right now in its pilot stages. I think they're targeting a 2021 completion of the North American constellation, which would be the number of the satellites that would serve North America. So by the end of 2021, we should have a kind of a complete view here in the U.S. Of what that service looks like, and some of the ups and downs. I've seen some concern on some message boards and whatnot about more urban residents trying to subscribe to that or subscribing to that and creating, I guess, additional traffic there, and it might have an impact on rural subscribers. But I think it's probably just a little too early for us to know the reliability issues there. But so far, it seems like that solution is working out pretty well. Then there was another question about what can and should be done to improve on FCC data, which can be pretty misleading. That was the question that came in, and the FCC's reporting requirements certainly leave room for clarity in the way that the providers provide the service or provide their information and data. The data itself is required to be submitted at a census block level, which in rural Michigan and other rural parts of the country can be rather large geographies. And so there's plenty of room for inaccuracies there. Lots of providers, unfortunately, they don't have the data systems to create all of the information there. And so there are some hiccups that happen there. The FCC is currently in the process of trying to update that. However, they essentially need Congress to provide them the funding to go forward with an update to the FCC data collection or the 477 data collection process. And that's kind of most recent, I guess the most recent news on what would happen with FCC 477 data, which is what's used and it's being alluded to in that question. Any other questions or comments from our panelists?
Yeah, just looking at, there was one question that came through about the reasoning for why funds are available to ISPs only and not local governments. In the CMIC grant, that was a decision by the legislature when the enabling legislation was passed, creating that grant originally back at the end of 2018. And then when it was renewed again earlier this year, that's one provision that the legislature left in that grant enabling legislation, was that it was only for internet service providers and did not include local governments or other organizations. So that would be a legislative decision. And there's another question about funding being made available to small WISPs. We had quite a few WISPs apply for funding for the first round of CMIC grants. But if there are certain, if certain parts of the, certain requirements of the application process that are cumbersome to some, I'd be more than happy to hear what those are, so that we can get things, more streamlined. The state of Michigan is the one that defined what those issues are, or what those application requirements are, and what needs to be submitted. But definitely want to make sure we're streamlining that and making that funding available to as many entities as possible.
All right. Well, we have definitely gone past our 30-minute mark. I think that it was good, good question session there, and want to thank each of our panelists and all of our guests today who've been able to join us. We will be, as I mentioned earlier, starting on January 19th, doing these webinars bi-weekly. We start off on January 19th with Eric talking more specifically about state-related efforts, and we'll have a full schedule from then till through June, really. And so we look forward to being able to join or be with you every other week, I should say. And we from each and every one of us with Connected Nation Michigan and Connected Nation, we wish you a happy holidays. Goodbye.
Happy holidays.
Thanks, everyone.